So I will turn it over to Dr. Deb Morrison, who will be facilitating our next panel with our amazing panelists. So we've got Esati Cintron Rodriguez from Columbia University and Citizens Climate International, who does incredible work on climate summits and collaborative and representative climate planning. We have Morgan Szabo from NOAA, who does great work with citizen or community science, not citizen science, and for heat islands and making sure that we are protecting people in extreme heat events. Michaela Martinez from We Act for Environmental Justice, who does a lot around environmental health in New York and around the country, and with policy and at the federal and local levels. And then, of course, Deb Morrison, who works at the University of Washington and Clear Environmental on all of these boundary spanning issues. So great. With Deb, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks for having all of us here and for facilitating this conversation generally inside the AGU community. So really excited to have this talk today. All right, so we have a number of different questions that we're going to talk around. And so maybe I will start with Michaela, if you want to start us off with thinking about how do scientists and community partners show up in your work? Like, where is science in this effort of this boundary between community and justice?
Yeah, well, I am an ecologist that works at a social justice organization. So science and community shows up every single day. But what I will tell you is the way that science plays out within community work is really different from how it plays out in academia or, let's say, federal work. We try to have our research programs really motivated by what we're getting from our community members and what people are concerned about. And so now I used to be an academic before I was in a community org. And yeah, as academics, are usually used to thinking up like, what's my dream project? What do I want to be working on right now? What's the state of the science? Whereas if you're in a community-based organization, you really have to do deep listening about like, what are people's needs? What data do we need to advocate for our community members? And then you formulate the science based on that. And so it's a different way of kind of seeing the world and seeing how we progress through science. And then also how we measure the success of science is very different. If we're focusing on community, we're really wanting to change people's lives. So it's not about manuscripts. It's not about the number of grants. It's, were we actually able to take action based on these data? So that's how it's different for me and my organization.
Thank you. And I also just noticed that I'm very informal, so I use first names, but I do want to acknowledge Dr. Martinez and Dr. Cintron Rodriguez. It gives me great pleasure to say Dr. Cintron Rodriguez. So I know that that's relatively newly minted and well earned. So thank you for that, but just to name that into the space. Esatis, what about yourself?
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to be here today and have, like this wonderful panelists. I think, how community shows up in my work. I think I derive a lot of inspiration from it. So like that's debate. Yeah, I think like that's the foremost important thing. I span between the two words, right? Like I am a climate scientist, but also an activist, and I do hold several hats as a community organizer and director of an NGO, as well as an academic. So I span the two words. I am a postdoc at Columbia in focusing in climate justice work. So within this frame, my hope is to transform the system so that we will be able to really co-develop knowledge and also practices with the communities that know what is happening on the ground, what they need. And several times, as Michaela said before, a lot of academics come with like, I have this big project and it will be good for you. But, they didn't ask anyone if that was good for them. So like the way that it shows in my work is really both working in partnership and at the same level of my community partners through developing proposals that elevate and center their needs in themselves, right? Like a lot of, I know that we'll talk a little bit more about barriers after, but I think that the way that we develop grants, projects, that is very important to really have community leading and making sure that it responds to the critical needs that the community. So I do citizen assemblies that work with elevating and enhancing climate governance and making sure that the voices of those that have been stewarding the environment and leading climate justice are at the forefront.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because when we start talking about knowledge, we have to really broaden what we think of as knowledge, like who defines whose knowledge and for whom and for what action. So yeah, definitely hear that. And those relationships, we'll come back to that idea of relational, sustained relationship building, because I think you hit on something really critical there for the work we're talking about. Morgan, would you like to weigh in on that first question?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So as mentioned, I work for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And one of the main programs that I work on and manage within that is a urban heat island mapping campaign program. And to your question, it is the science community interface is absolutely there. And in our program, the community volunteers are the scientists. And it's a really unique program that has volunteers from 70 plus communities across the country and a few international locations now too, that we've relied on, that the communities work with us, and we rely on the volunteers from these community to go out and collect heat temperature data in their community. And that allows them to not only gain knowledge about how heat is impacting their neighborhoods, what are the differences between different neighborhoods that contribute to one neighborhood being a lot hotter, but also really allows them to be part of this scientific process. And they're with us from the beginning of collecting this temperature data, getting the community together, but then also to the end as the communities are starting to get this data back and understand what it means and start to implement solutions. So it's a really great relationship we've been able to do. And we've been doing this program since 2017, again, in so many communities across the country, and getting as much of a geographical distribution as we can too. And we just finished up our most recent set of cities from the summer, and really interested to see what those differences are. But the community volunteers are obviously the bread and butter of the program. It couldn't be done without them. It's just over the course of one day that these volunteers go out and collect this data measurements. And so it's been really great to also get the testimonials from the volunteers too, and hear what their experience was. And we've got people from young kids at ages, 5 up to older adults. And so it's really great to see the age distributions and just the community really being involved in this program.
That's terrific. Thank you. It's interesting because as we start to think about how this type of work can unfold, what questions we start to identify in community for interrogation, for building these types of inquiries, it starts to highlight some of the challenges that we might face. So the second question that we wanted to sort of lean into a little bit was, what challenges have you had working between science or scientific and localized communities? And I kind of want to be careful about the binary here, because local communities, as we're talking about, do have scientific activity and scientists in them. So we're talking about the sort of establishment scientific community when we say science, and the sort of historically common ways of doing things in powerful scientific roles. There's long histories of science in many communities, and scientists acting in that. So just we'll be a little cautious about creating it as too binary. But would anybody like to answer or provide some thoughts on this to begin with? Satis, do you want to start?
I can start. Yeah. So in my work, whenever I work with science and communities, I also bring in policymakers. And, one of the challenges is that, we have, for example, in my island, Puerto Rico, we have a very big challenge of what is the coastal zone and the construction of the coastal zone, right? So communities and planners want that the science tells like this is the most that you can build, but then the scientists are like, well, I cannot really tell you a number, I can tell you a range. So there is like a difference on the purpose, like developing knowledge and the purpose of like implementing that knowledge. And I think that we need to really be in communication. I think like those conversations need to be very common, like a frequent, so that we're all in sync and that we can give the most useful comments, because a range wasn't useful at that point. But I think that some of the other barriers that we find is really in the bureaucracy of the institutions of academia itself. Like, for example, when we have something, that all scientists like doing, it's like, oh, I want to work with the community. And it's like, okay, like we have this grant, right? And then you write the grant supposedly with the community, but then the overhead, right? Like the money that grants take for the institution goes to the academic institution in building their internal capacity. But then the people that really need that internal capacity is the community. So it's kind of like, even when the best intentions are there, you have this kind of extractive by default of the grant that won't lead to more resources in the community. So I think like that's a very big challenge. So that's the second challenge. And then the third challenge that I think that we need to, kind of hone in some of our scientists is that I often find that the way that they approach is like, we need to educate the community, right? And I know that we need to build some capacities, but I think that there needs to be more work in understanding that it's a two-way, right? Like that we can learn from them and then they can learn from us, right? Like definitely we have some other expertise that they don't have, but they also have expertise in technical, right? Like, so I think like they're like, yeah, like they have observational knowledge and kind of like disregard. So I think like those are the three main challenges that I have seen in working or trying to work between like scientists and community.
That's great. Michaela or Morgan? Michaela?
Sure. I just wanted to say I completely agree. And those were really great points that you brought up. Yeah, so just building on that, I agree that just the way that academic institutions are set up, that a lot of community-based partnerships are extractive by default, just because the way professors get paid, the way that grants are set up. But also there's a big problem when it comes to how science is funded in the United States. Most of the major granting organizations, EPA, NIH. We also get a little bit of funds here and there from FDA. They're used to giving out grants to academic institutions. And when it comes to community-based organizations, they don't, there aren't big grant programs that are regularly in support of building capacity within CBOs themselves. And so when you're constantly building up capacity within academic institutions and neglecting to do so within community-based organizations, you are largely putting them in the position that they always have to be tied to academics in order to have big pots of funding. Now, some of that's changing now with the EPA and the Justice 40 funds coming out from the Inflation Reduction Act, but largely it's been a huge structural problem. And so that's one difficulty. And yeah, I think that most scientists, and I come from an ecology and environmental health background, aren't really trained to be advocates and don't really even know the difference between advocacy and activism. And I think that that's something that really needs to be discussed and should be weaved more into, our graduate student training, especially when it comes to areas of public health, climate change, and what is, the ethical and moral responsibility of scientists to act as advocates, even if it might be uncomfortable for them, if they don't want to be, their research seem to be politicized and such. So those are hard conversations that we need to have.
And maybe I'll just add something before going over to Morgan. I completely agree with this issue of structural funding, strategic funding spaces. A couple years ago, we worked with a consortium of environmental justice and climate justice folks across the US, both in community and university, using Dr. Beverly Wright's work around Communiversity. Like, how do we actually shift power dynamics in that work? But also provide sustained structural work that's not only grants, because it's very time and cost intensive to apply for grants constantly, and who sees them and who doesn't, and just writing grants is complicated. So getting some more sustained funding. And the EPA, Environmental Justice Arm of the EPA's work on the Thriving Community Network this year was a result of some of that work. Satis told me about that in June when we were chatting, that it got funded, and I didn't realize that it had gotten funded, all that advocacy work that we'd done. So, but again, it was sustained funding for communities and led by communities, but it was only funded at like a fifth of the capacity of what we thought it should be funded at. So, definitely a big need there for that kind of capacity building. Morgan, do you want to add? And I think there's an additional question specific for you. So if you want to address that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, just to piggyback off what you were just saying, Deb, before I started working for NOAA, I was with a community-based organization, and not just the writing grant aspect of it, it's also managing the milestones and all the reporting afterwards. So just a huge hassle. So I totally understand that. But with our program, I think one of the challenges we face with the communities is, especially after they participate in this big, data mapping, get the community involved. There's so much rallying going on. And then after they get a report back that explains what happens, it can be slow to action of that local community implementing solutions based on that data. So it could be a few years go by and nothing is done in that community. And a lot of that could be based on funding. It could be the policies in place in that location. But I know that we've heard from some of the communities just the frustration of no action being taken since this big effort of participation was done. So we hold big cohort calls of all of these communities, and the leaders from each of these cities are invited to talk about what they're up to and what they've been implementing in their cities. So to really help foster those relationships building in that network, to hope that they can learn from each other in that process too. So it's a challenge that we're trying to address on a couple different levels, but something that we've definitely heard that slow to action response.
Would anybody else like to pick up on that before we move to the next question? Because I think both of the other speakers have named issues of how we sort of move into implementation work. Do you want to add anything before we move on? Not yet. Okay, let's throw another question on the table here. This kind of gets at the same idea, is what are these best practices, things we need to consider when working in this interface between academia or institutional based scientists, other scientists and community members more broadly. So what are those things that we need to do? And maybe I'll seed this with a thought that I'm hearing in the conversation so far, and that is the idea of sustained relationships, if we can come back to that a little bit. So how do we build those type of sustained partnerships that aren't just grant based, but that are deeply led and like held in relationship? Michaela, do you want to start us off in this direction?
Sure. Well, WE ACT has had over 30 years of collaboration with Columbia University, particularly the School of Public Health. So I think we're a good model for community and academic partnership. But one thing I will say is it takes constant work. It's not like you build a relationship and then all of a sudden, you're good to go for forever. And so I think one of the biggest things is just understanding what success, differences in measures of success, differences in capacity, and even just like desired outcomes. So I think me, running the research program at a CBO, one of the first things I tell academics when they, approach me is like, well, here's what we're interested in, here's what we need, and like these are the parameters in which this will make this a happy, functional collaboration, acknowledging our differences. Because if everybody tries to act like it's all going to be easy and smooth and like everybody has the same goals, then you actually will hit a lot of bumps along the way, especially because within the environmental justice space, the advocacy space, our pace is so much faster than in the academic space. And so they're just basic things like that, where it's just like really clear communication about your differences can actually lend itself to really nice collaborations, because then you can actually navigate the different institutional kind of models. So yeah, I would say that's a first place to start.
Satis, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think what I have seen, and I would like this being more institutionalized, have been in like independent researchers that are more attuned to working in this kind of way. And I think like the co-production of any kind of project or any kind of analysis, assessment from the start to the finish, right? Like, and making sure that whatever like the report is, like that data is both shared, but also like the the interpretation of results is also consulted, with the community. I think like that's one big place where I have seen could work. There was a work actually here at Columbia that worked with South Bronx. And then they were working in creating this heat island map and trying to compare. So from the beginning, they came with like, oh, like we think that this is a great idea, but receiving community input, they're like, okay, like that's a great idea, but it would be great if we compare it, like South Bronx with the area around Columbia University, and we can see, like the disparities of work. So even like from the research design perspective, I would like to say that there are rather than another thing, I guess like there's a lot of in my head that are good practices, but they're like very small. For example, like a university in Florida, they have a professor position that is like their job is in community engagement, because the way that one of the things that it's a barrier for us as academic is that the way that we are evaluated, it's on papers and grants, right? Like, and for like some of the academics that do more of the community engagement, that doesn't factor in. So the FAMU created this position that is a professorship on community engagement, and from Columbia, we are developing a climate justice center or lab. We still don't know the framing of it, but the idea is that it will surpass, like some of like the like-minded, and it will create like a dimension for the university, right? Like that is the hope of those of us who are involved at the climate school, right? Like we're like, okay, like how do we do the research, right? Like what are the principles that need to guide research? How do we make sure that we have long-lasting relationship with communities, right? Like can we have a liaison with communities and that identify the needs, so that academics don't come parachuting or identifying projects that are not aligned with the communities. When we are having, like the learning, like making sure that climate is inside, but also how do we bring frontline faculty? Like how do we recognize and make people from the community part of our faculty, like in one sense or another. Then we're talking about advocacy. What are the principles for partnerships? Then if we're talking about breaking the barriers, that something that is so small as making a payment for like a community-based organization, that it's sometimes so complicated within our system. How do we break that, right? But all of that takes a lot of work at the institutional level. But I think that there are good pathways that we've seen. Well, there is this good practice here, good practice. How do we bring that into like a holistic way of working with communities? Because if we're going to advance climate justice, it's together. And, like we cannot do it without the communities being at the forefront, so that we're not, like often in science, right? Like we rely on like technocratic solutions and for things. So I think then those would be like some of my best practices that I have seen, like in co-production that I have seen in like many different ways. I mentioned an example, professorship, and then some good pathways going forward, potentially into what could be a way to engage.
It's interesting because as you say that, Estetis, I think the other thing that flags for me is how do we actually make it so that when we talk about the academy, we're actually deeply talking about community embedded scholars. So like, how do we actually ensure that that 50 or 53 at my institution % overhead that is going on is dedicated to scholarships for community members pursuing advanced degrees, that they're involved in the building of that capacity in community organizations or whatever else might be asked, so that it's not that binary of who has and hasn't the education or the capacities and the credentials that are so powerful in our society. I think that's also part of that structural move. And I see there's also a couple additional kinds of questions around that structural aspect of, I think Kripa has named a couple around how do we shift these unjust structures, both in institutions and in some of the citizen-based science. So maybe Morgan, if you want to weigh in a little bit on some of that end of it, because we often have this challenge when we face issues of equity work in the sciences or distributed scientific work, that we do have that sort of volunteer basis, which can be useful and a benefit, but also could perpetuate like the labor and who's benefiting from the labor or being like acknowledged for the labor they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll loop it into the original question too. I think one of the most important things that we can do, not only just building the relationships with the community, but listening. And especially from the perspective of the federal government, we can't just go into a community and be like, all right, here's what you need to do and then leave. That's not how it works. It's working with communities, understanding where they are in their level of planning, what they need from us, so we can inform research. It can help us to make new products and change how we work with their relationship with them. And I think that's something so powerful that we've gotten to do with the program I've talked about. And to loop in equity with that too, one of the things that a lot of the communities wanted to better understand when they have their data of how the heat distribution is impacting their community and overlaying that with some of the socioeconomic data. And so we built a tool on our website, heat.gov, that allows these communities to better understand. So doing at the census tract level, really doing a deeper dive of, okay, if this neighborhood is a lot hotter than this neighborhood, but they also have all of these additional factors on top of that make them so much more disproportionately impacted. So that was one really great way that we listened to what the communities needed and built a product and a tool that helped them to be able to start implementing and changing different things of how they can make that community better, maybe by adding more trees in that hotter neighborhood because they know that there's a lot less tree canopy, and they know that there's this huge community support based on this volunteer effort that they can help with the tree sustainability.
Thank you. Actually, Portland, Portland Clean Energy Fund is a good example of that, where it's justice led. So the actions are actually justice organization led as well. So there's funding from the tax base moving into those climate solutions, and they're being defined by communities.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Morgan. No, go ahead.
I know Justice 40 was brought up, and our program is covered under the Biden administration's Justice 40 program too. So it's something that equity is at the forefront of the mind when we move forward with our program.
That's terrific. The Bullard Center, I believe it is, has launched in collaboration with many organizations across the U.S. Justice 40 initiative sort of watchdog effort to ensure that there is, and I think actually we act as involved in that work as well, just to make sure that that money as it moves into implementation is actually doing that sort of justice leadership move. Sorry, I'm not sure if Asatis or Michaela would like to go next. Anybody? So Asatis, do you want to go, and then we'll flip back over to Michaela?
Yeah. Sorry. So yeah, like in talking about like this, like Justice 40 and the IRA, right? Like, so recently, right? Like I'm trying to connect with a question that was in the chat, talking about overheads. So recently there was a NOAA Resilience Challenge. It was a very substantive call, right? But the amount that the overhead of Colombia is 53 or 56, which is not a 53 or 56 of the full amount, but it's still like, you know, like it's the overhead is always around the payroll, but it's still a huge chunk, right? Like if you're talking about a grant that is going into community, right? Like for implementation, 53, it's a lot. So there were two very different approaches in the university to approach this grant. One of them worked with the university itself to try to bring the overhead down. And they were able to bring it down to, I think, 26 or 27%. So that's a big, it's still a lot, right? Like when you think about 30% taking off, but it's still a very big, and that was only, I think, around the first, I'm not going to say the number because I would be wrong, but it was not of the full amount. It was 26% only of a certain amount of the grant, and then the rest will not have overhead, which is a big victory. And then another, which I did, right? Like I wrote the proposal with a community-based organization, and the community-based organization will get all the overhead, and then I will work as the connection with the community, with the university here. But then I make sure that the grants, I mean, like why I wrote that grant was not necessarily for my academic benefit, and mostly because it was like, oh, like there is this great opportunity to really enhance the flow of funds to implementation, which we have not seen in Puerto Rico. We have a lot of planning funds. There's plans everywhere. We have we have a sea of PDFs, but it's like, where are the projects? So it was a great opportunity. I mean, like right now we don't have the grant yet, but that was the, like, and that can happen, and I have heard within the same call, other academics did the same. They help writing the grant and making sure, but then like they step out of the way. It's like, my institution will not take the overhead of this, and there's some things that, like there might be some other grants where that might be harder to do, but like, I think that if we can raise the awareness and the willingness of academics to really step out of the way, especially when funding opportunities are called to help implement at frontline communities, we will be like much better. So I think like we need to work that through and make sure that also, like the the institutions understand, like this might be exceptions, etc. But yeah, just wanted to call on that very specific example.
Thank you, Michaela.
Yeah, so are we still going back to the question about what are some difficulties, or are we moving on to things about
The practices, sort of some of the practices around what works for you and how equitable and just relationships or practices are kind of
Yeah.
built into the work. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't want to be too redundant, so I guess one thing in terms of, so there is a lot of focus on equity, but I think one thing to note is really important is that like really the end goal should be justice. And so really thinking carefully about when we're collecting data, what is the root problem that we're trying to fix? And that root problem is usually a pretty big system. And so if the work isn't tied to something very actionable like policy or getting money into the right hands for the right kind of project that's actually going to remedy a very problematic system, then it's insufficient. It might be good, but insufficient to fix the system. So I think that's something that's really important, because in academia we tend to have a big focus on equity, but like justice is a whole nother game.
Thank you. It's interesting because in partnership work, one of those systemic issues is that piece that Asatis was naming of like, how do we actually ensure that money lands with justice organizations so that leadership in terms of defining and controlling activity and actions is in the hands of those who should be defining it. So, and that's very uncomfortable for many scientific organizations or academic organizations to be in partnerships that way. So do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, well, and I think even to add another layer to it, so Dr. Citron Rodriguez mentioned work at the South Bronx, which I'm guessing is South Bronx Unite, and which are also close partners with us. But even like a university partnering with the community group and putting money into our hands, that's still not putting money into the community's hands. Like we work very hard to get data and funds and things for that like actual community. Like we're still all like staff serving a community. Some of us, I live here in Harlem. Harlem is my home, and I happen to be an advocate that's based here. But also, there are lots of staff from CVOs that in different stages of their career might not be living and representing a community that's like where they're from either. So like we are still conduits for our actual like community members. So that's something that universities also have to realize, like by putting like funds in WEAC's hands or others, they're still like the people that are the ones that need to be served, and like need to ask, are we really serving them, or are we like on paper partnering with a community organization? So like I encourage scientists who try to collaborate with us, like come get a talk at one of our community meetings, because you will be your sense of like whatever, we're all like built up as scientists to think we know everything, and like there's this very ivory tower sense in academia, but I think every scientist should put themselves in front of actual community members and give a scientific talk, and then see how valuable is their actual research to people that are being impacted on the day-to-day lives. Because you will get a little bit jostled and realize that we live in a very kind of disconnected world when our transactions are about like papers and not really tapping into like hyper local knowledge. So yeah, I think that's something, it's very uncomfortable conversation to have when you realize like that you've been overlooking some of the most important things. But I would say that a lot of academic scientists that make their careers around community-based participatory research still largely can be missing the mark. And that's just me having been on both sides of the fences, and I will like even include myself in that.
Yeah,
Um,
me too.
we all need kind of like a reality check.
Yeah, I just had a conversation this morning with one of my colleagues about making sure that we're doing that too, just in like writing practices about authorship, or even just how to engage in writing practices. Like, maybe the timeline is different for what we need. Even if we have the best interests like in our head, it still doesn't mean that that's the right way to go forward. So we have to, be a little more humble and step back. Morgan, do you want to add anything? I reposted the question, and we're thinking about like best practices to consider when working to interface the science and community.
Yeah, I think a very important thing too when working with communities is, especially if you're gathering as many people as you can, is really making sure that all of the relevant stakeholders are present and not leaving anyone out. Because I think we've seen way too many meetings that large portions of populations are not included or do not have a seat at these tables. And that is so important to make sure that everyone's voice is being heard and not leaving anyone out. An example of this is a few months ago, we were doing a climate and equity pilot project in a couple different cities, and we held these tabletop scenario exercises. So if a extreme heat event happens in your city, how do you react? What do you do? And doing long-term resilience planning too. And we were really trying to make sure that at this table, there was a representative from as many groups as possible who would be impacted, who have a voice for the people who will be responding, who will be impacted by this. And so it's really important to make sure that everyone is at the table.
It's interesting. There's a follow-up question for some of our conversation here about how do we address timeline mismatch between granting agencies? Wow, that is something that I've like struggled with for a long time. So maybe does anybody have best practices for how to handle the issue of grant programs and funding? And I guess this comes a little back to what Michaela just said around like, if grants and like smaller projects are missing the mark of what is the goal, then maybe that's not where we want to, that's not the grant we're looking for. I don't know. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that there are easy ways to address this. It just has to be super intentional, right? So like understanding that you have like multiple timelines at play, right? You have the timelines of grants, you have the timelines of policy, like when's the state legislature in, when is the federal, like if you're actually doing work that's informing policy, you also have that to factor in. And then you are factoring, and also if you're working with academics, they have timelines in terms of like trainees, like you have a postdoc, a graduate student. And so it just needs to be very intentionally planned. But like on the community side, we do that as well. Like I met with our policy director, state policy director today to be like, okay, this is a research study we have going on. When are you having to advocate for this particular bill? Like, when do I need to have these data in hand for it to be useful for you? So, having some of those conversations about strategy, why are we generating these data? When do those data need to be available? You might need to have a policy report out before you put out a manuscript. The manuscript might matter to the academics. The policy might matter for the community-based organization. So yeah, I think all of those things can be worked out. It just has to be super clear about individuals coming to the table with good intentions, and with being comfortable with laying down like very clear asks and boundaries and guidelines, because then that's how things are able to get done efficiently. Like, and you kind of have win-win situations, but it needs to be well communicated.
Asatis, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the problem starts way before the timeline starts, because I think that when you go to a community with a deadline, it can go two different ways. It can go, if you have built the relationships, right? Like if you have built the relationships, the community will understand because the community already trusts you. But if you're like just opening up, like it's like, oh, I have this project and I want to work with this community, but I don't have the connections, that's when there's the mismatch of timelines, because the community, like if you have done the work, and sometimes that takes time, that takes, you know, like 1-2 years, you know, and like I know that we, you know, like, well, I don't include myself in that, but I know that as academics that might be a very long time, you know, but when I go to a community, they know I'm not going away when the project is over. So when I say like, oh, yeah, I know that like that would be the best way, but you know, like I'm a little bit tight on time, you know, like they trust me that I have their best interest and they work with me with the timeline. So I think the problem starts with creating long-lasting relationship with communities, you know, intentionally in understanding their needs. Because when you're, you know, like they also apply, well, maybe not exactly the communities, but like community-based organizations, they apply for grants too. So they know they're familiar with timelines. But when there is like, oh, this will benefit us, right? Like they will put the time and the effort to work within those boundaries. So I think it's just like, unfortunately, it's just making sure that our timelines are longer, and that when we are wanting to create a project, we go into a place where those connections, right? Because the work moves at the speed of trust, right? Like, so we need to create that before like establishing a timeline for someone we don't even know, right? Like I don't think like that's a smart way to do it, you know. Like if you want to do it without the community, that's a different aspect, but when we're talking about creating a project with the community, this is the only way that it works. And there are ways to speed that up in creating, you know, like connections with people that have established trust. Which what I have, I think that when you have an institution, there should be like a connection with the community that goes beyond one researcher, like that the institution itself has a relationship with the community, understands their needs. So when, you know, like when an academic is like, oh, I want to do like heat island effect with this community, the institution is like, well, wait a second, they already are working with another person, or like they're definitely not interested in that, right? Like they can broker that relationship within the institution because there is work, but that requires that you go to their community meetings, that requires that you go to more informal settings where you just like talk to people and understand them. So I think like that timeline, like we need to like not think about in the frame of a project and think about, you know, how do we build those relationships?
And I think this brings us to our final question, and we're wrapping up here. I see we're just at time here, but maybe a last thought from each of you on how we think about this as people are starting to get engaged. And I think, Asantes, you've named for us that deep focus on structural relationship connections between organizations. It's very helpful to think about that because that is a structural approach, a strategic approach to it. Is there any sort of final thoughts, Morgan or Michaela, that you'd like to add to this?
I do want to make one last comment before we go to the very last question about how people get engaged. So I agree that it's super important for scientists to, like academic scientists, to build trust and like be present and have that long trusted relationship. But it also needs to be acknowledged that many of the scientists that are doing this tend to come from marginalized backgrounds and tend to be scientists of color. And institutionally, there's no reward for that, right? So like that is unpaid labor. And so, you know, whether it be that institutions need to like dedicate hard money funds to those tenure track lines and, you know, relieve some of the teaching duties or administrative duties for people to get that work done, like it needs to be acknowledged because, you know, over and over and over again, we see scientists of color and particularly junior scientists taking career hits for taking that time to invest, because that time that they're investing and building these relationships is time, you know, that they're having to take away from other things. So there really needs to be like an actual hard institutional acknowledgement of that. And then in terms of how can scientists get more engaged, I think every scientist that wants to get engaged in community-based research should be a member of their local environmental justice organization or social justice organization. You know, yesterday I was at the climate march with one of my colleagues who we both used to be faculty at Columbia. Now she's at CUNY and I'm at WEACT. And we're there at the climate march and we're like, do we think we're going to see any of our other colleagues here? We're like, definitely not. And it's like, why? We know all these climate scientists, we know, but we're like, we're not, because scientists are not used to like really being that engaged outside of their institutional constructs. So I think that that's something that people need to do.
Oh, thank you. Morgan?
Yeah, I think to leave a note with everyone is just the power of working with communities, and never underestimate the knowledge that people from these communities knows, and be able to work with them in such an intentional way, to be able to build those trusted relationships, to listen, to understand what they need and how you can provide those services, products, tools for them.
Satis, do you want a last thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think like these are all great points. And I still think that it's just building relationships, just get to know people, you know. I know that there's not, you know, sometimes even communities, you know, like even if it's not like an environmental climate justice community, like when I go back to Puerto Rico, I always connect with and it's different because in Puerto Rico I still see my colleagues at the march. So I think it's just like a difference of, you know, we are all marginalized. So we're like, we are on the street, right? And it's still not encouraged by the university, but we're still there. But I think like in connecting, I think like that connection, just like lean into it, make sure that you're hearing and like make that part of your, you know, like we take time to read papers. So take time to get to know the community. I think like it's as important if we really want to do this transformational work.
Thank you. And thank you all for your participation. I think my last thought to this would also be like when we're thinking about academic structures and how scientists of color, scientists who are in and with community are engaged in the work, we need to ensure that they're getting the things they need to move strategically inside the academic system. And that might include both funding and time, but it also includes like really deeply intentional authoring, because that's a coin of the realm in a lot of academia. And so really ensuring that that's happening, because I've heard of many scientists from different communities who are not the first author on their papers, and neither is their community members, that it's a scientist who is more disconnected from the work, and that can't be happening. Like we need to be really thinking carefully about those types of justice structures in the academy. So thank you all for that. And I'm going to turn it back to Haley here, who I think is going to shift us into some group time. Is that correct?